Joining us now, the author of Fire and Fury Inside the Trump White House, Michael Wolff. Michael, thank you very much for being here. I know it has been a long day, a long weekend.
Thank you, sir.
A weekend unlike any in your life. You knew that this pressure was coming. You knew what you were writing. You knew how this White House operates. You knew how this president operates. You might not have specifically known there would be a cease and desist letter from lawyers, but the attacks that you have faced from the White House, from the Trump machine, since this book came out, is that what you expected?
No. I expected some response. Did I expect the president to basically drop everything? I had heard from a source who still speaks to me that he wanted my media schedule for today. He's probably spent his whole day just watching me on television. The man is, among other things, the man is an obsessive. That's how he responds to things. So he responded to this. I mean, it is literally crazy to write a cease and desist. A president has never done that. A prior restraint of a book to say his privacy has been invaded, that he's been defamed. This has never happened before. Also, let's remember, the effect is just to sell more books. So he shoots himself in the foot in this instance, as in many other instances, and then to go on days of tweeting, and then obviously to culminate in this, in going in front of the American people and saying, I'm sane. I'm actually a very stable guy.
Very stable genius.
A very stable genius. I am a genius and I'm stable. Nobody could have predicted this, even of Donald Trump.
One of the things he said since the book came out is he doesn't know you. He doesn't know this guy. How long have you known him?
Since the 1990s. So I was at New York Magazine, and I was one of the people he used to call up to complain about what was said, actually usually about what articles that he was not in that he wanted to be in. I used to see him on the, cocktail parties. I've literally known, I mean, we're hardly friends, but I have known him for a good long time. When I interviewed him in June 2016, just before the convention, it was like old homecoming week. Michael Wolff, oh my God, I cannot believe.
He welcomed you into his home in Los Angeles during the campaign. Sat there eating vanilla ice cream with you.
Even more, so I actually, it was sort of set up, and then I met him at the Kimmel show, and went in, and then he said to an aide, how long do we have? And they said 45 minutes. I can see the look that came over his face. He says, "You don't give Michael Wolff 45 minutes." And then he said, "Why not, after the show, why don't you come back to the house, and we'll hang out?" Now that was actually interesting because nobody even knew he had a house in the middle of Beverly Hills.
I learned it through your article. Yeah.
Amazing.
Yeah. Let me go to something that Tony Blair has said, because this goes to the contesting elements of the book, and this is the most significant one I've seen. Some of the others are literally about how many L's in Hillary, in the name Hillary Rosen, and I learned through the correction of your book that there is only one. I've known Hillary for decades. I didn't know that. Tony Blair, in the book, there's this passage, page 157. In February, Blair visited Kushner in the White House. On this trip, the now freelance diplomat, seeking to prove that his usefulness to this new White House, imparted a juicy nugget of information. There was, he suggested, the possibility that the British had the Trump campaign staff under surveillance, monitoring its telephone calls and other communications, and possibly even Trump himself. Now, Tony Blair said about this, the story is a complete fabrication, literally from beginning to end. I've never had such a conversation in the White House, outside the White House, with Jared Kushner, with anyone else.
What I know about this is that this was reported to me by two different sources, and then I do know that shortly after this conversation, Jared Kushner and Steve Bannon jumped into a car. They went out to Langley, had a meeting with the director of the CIA and the deputy director, who reported that this was a miscommunication. And then
And you fully recount that in the book, the follow-up, that they go out to the CIA and the CIA says, there's nothing there.
Right.
Yeah.
So if you're in the position of the reporter, you think, that sounds pretty much like something happened there. And I'm very careful, and I don't know how Tony Blair reported this. I hear maybe a suggestion, have you thought of, et cetera, et cetera. But I would be overwhelmingly certain that something related to Tony Blair's suggestion that the Brits might have wiretapped happened.
Yeah, and by the way, we're not going to be able to get to this kind of detail, but I'll just refer to it. One of the reasons the book is so fascinating and necessary reading is just how does Tony Blair know Jared Kushner? And that is a fascinating little piece in and of itself that we'll have to save for another time or just buy the book.
As a little, I was, when that happened, as so much happened, I'm sitting on the couch in the West Wing, and there is Jared Kushner and Tony Blair coming out.
So you see them together?
So totally, and I actually overheard. I'm overhearing the discussion, which I obviously immediately take a note on, and they're talking about the difficulties of the Middle East situation, and Jared says to Tony Blair, "Damn it, we can solve this problem."
And that's in the lobby of the West Wing.
Yeah.
And that is kind of like, for people who don't know it, it's kind of like a hotel lobby, and people pass through from each side of it. And that kind of moment can occur. I remember working in the Senate and the Finance Committee, going up there for a tax meeting, and there's the CIA director sitting over there in the next chair. And you have these encounters that can only happen in that lobby.
And it's a very interesting, because you go over there, you get the appointment, they pass you in, you go there, and then, of course, the appointment, it drifts.
Yes.
It drifts.
You wait, and you wait, and you wait.
For hours.
Yeah.
And you think, this is really annoying, and how can they do this to me? But then you realize, oh, my God, it's all going right. You just see it all.
Right. And the less organized a White House, the more valuable it is to hang out in the lobby. I want to go to an important and possibly Shakespearean-style quote from what seems to be your principal source in the book, Steve Bannon. He said, "The daughter will take down the father." What did he mean?
He meant, in his, as he puts it, every piece of advice they have given has been bad advice.
Ivanka Trump and her husband, Jared Kushner.
And in the end, he believed that they would protect themselves over the president, that the advice that they gave him was advice fundamentally to protect them that would ultimately damage him. Comey, obviously, the prime example.
Comey firing was their idea, urged by them.
Certainly pushed by them.
Opposed by Steve Bannon in this account.
As Steve Bannon said, and I spent a lot of time. You come to actually like Steve Bannon, even if you don't agree.
I don't know.
With
I'm not sure you pulled off that magic trick.
But his insights. So, anyways, so in this regard, he said, when Donald Trump is worked up, it means somebody has been working him up.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and you detail exactly how they work that, and you are expressing Jared Kushner's concerns to be quite a range of concerns, everything from possible investigations of Trump family business, but also to Kushner family business, including his father, Charlie Kushner, who's already been convicted of federal crimes
and gone to jail.
Gone to jail. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, one of the issues here is Charlie Kushner, which Bannon obviously believes, is he imperiled? And if he's imperiled, who would Jared Kushner choose between, his father or his father-in-law? In the book, Steve Bannon calls Don Jr. Fredo, a reference to The Godfather, and the weak son in The Godfather. We have now seen Steve Bannon come out with a statement in which he says that his comments in the book, now famous comments about the Don Jr. meeting at Trump Tower during the campaign with Russians being treasonous, that was not aimed at Don Jr. He says that was aimed at Paul Manafort. But let's also acknowledge that in that statement, he does not dispute, he has an opportunity to, he does not dispute a single word in this book attributed to Steve Bannon. No, I think he tries to triangulate the least the least revision he can, and that's to say it's about Manafort. But trust me, it was about Don Jr. It was about Fredo. It was about, as he says, Don Jr. will be cracked like an egg on national television.
And Don Jr. is not the only one. He says that Donald Trump's longtime lawyer, Michael Cohen, will also be cracked like an egg, that he has these complicated relationships. But a lot of the Bannon stuff sounds, people speculate about why would he say these things to you? Why would he say these things to you? Is he as uncontrollable a conversationist, self-control, I mean, as Donald Trump?
You know, it's one of two things. Either Steve has the most remarkable big mouth in history, or he has a strategy. And I tend to think that it's a strategy, and I tend to think that his strategy was Roy Moore would win. That would mean Steve Bannon would win, Donald Trump would lose. That means Steve Bannon would hold the leverage going into 2018. And Steve Bannon, in part using this book, would break with Donald Trump.
How much of your interviewing with Steve Bannon occurred after he was fired from the White House?
Well, very little.
So most of this is while he's in the White House, and what we read is a roller coaster ride for Bannon. There are days when he feels up and he feels like he's the one in control here of all these factions in the White House. There's other days where he feels like this could be my last day, I don't know.
Totally.
And how did that affect what you were getting out of him as a source? I mean, the guess of the reader sometimes is, well, this must be a really bad day for Bannon. He thinks he's going to be fired, therefore he's telling Michael Wolff all the worst stuff as he sees it.
Absolutely. Yeah. When he was riding high, it was those were the days that I would sit in the White House waiting for him, and the whole day would pass, and then somebody would come out and say, you know, we got to put this off until Thursday. When he was in the nadir, then it was hours and hours and hours of conversation.
What is there to say about policy making in the Trump White House? I've tried to figure out at the end of the book, try to figure out a way of describing it, and what in whatever way you would describe it, the president is kind of like the hubcap that gets put on the automobile at the end of the assembly line. He's kind of the last component to policy. He's just the person whose okay is needed at some point, but he's never generating anything in this.
He wants to have as little to do with this as possible. He wants someone else to do it. He wants Mitch McConnell to do it. Or he wanted Steve Bannon to do it, or sometimes he wants anyone else to do it but Donald Trump.
And Steve Bannon was the one who came up with what he believed was the right defense for the White House as a special prosecutor started to surround the White House, and that was to wall it all off and create what he considered this wall, leave any comment about the investigation to the Trump legal team outside of the White House, to the spokesperson for the Trump legal team outside of the White House. What went wrong with that strategy?
Donald Trump went wrong with that strategy. I mean, this was, and Steve would go over this, that he's saying this was not only the perfect strategy, but the only strategy. That in order to survive this kind of investigation, which he would then point out the Clintons endured and survived.
Because they handled it that way.
To do this, you had to be incredibly disciplined. And of course, his boss or client is the most undisciplined man in certainly ever to occupy the presidency, and maybe he may be the most undisciplined man in America.
There were several days in the course of the last year when Steve Bannon firmly believed that he was winning in these faction fights in the White House, and that Ivanka Trump and her husband would be back in Manhattan by now. There were plenty of times when he thought that. Turns out he's the one who's out. We're going to have to take a break here. Michael, we're going to come back with more. If you can please stay. Michael Wolff's book, Fire and Fury. When will people be able to buy this? That's all whenever people see me with this, they want to know when they can get their hands on it.
All I do is hear from my relatives all day because they can't get copies.
Is it this week? Is it back in stores? Do you know when?
Yeah.
We'll see.
I mean, they're rolling them out.
All right. And later we're going to have more information about Robert Mueller's Russia investigation. The President of the United States is now one of the next interview subjects Robert Mueller wants to talk to. I want to go to page 23 of the book, because we've been discussing a little bit about governing by family. I now want to talk about who this man is, who is the President of the United States. And this is the book where we learn things that we have never known or have never learned anywhere else. It says, Trump liked to say that one of the things that made life worth living was getting your friends' wives into bed. In pursuing a friend's wife, he would try to persuade the wife that her husband was perhaps not what she thought. Then he'd have his secretary ask the friend into his office. Once the friend arrived, Trump would engage in what was, for him, more or less constant sexual banter. Do you still like having sex with your wife? How often? You must have had better sex than your wife. Tell me about it. I have girls coming in from Los Angeles at 3 o'clock. We can go upstairs and have a great time, I promise. And all the while, Trump would have his friend's wife on the speakerphone listening in. Who is this man who is President of the United States?
Just the man.
Who is that man? Who is the man who does that?
Just a man without any scruples, a man whose only interest is his own instant gratification, a man who doesn't care about you or anybody else.
And these are his friends that we're talking about. This is how he deals with his friends.
Absolutely.
By the way, what did the lawyers at the publishing house have to say about that paragraph? How much time did they spend on that?
Well, they were confident the source was good on this.
You had to discuss, because there isn't any sourcing indicated on the page, but the lawyers had to have a conversation about that one.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
I want to get to a little bit more about this family dynamic. Page 252. Donald Trump's sons, Don Jr., 39, and Eric, 33, existed in an enforced infantile relationship to their father. Their father took some regular pleasure in pointing out that they were in the back of the room when God handed out brains. Why would he be entrusting his businesses to two kids who he doesn't think have the brains?
Well, Trump is in his heart of hearts, he's a naysayer. Everybody is a bad person. Everybody has disappointed him. Nobody is as smart as him. Less so. She's the one who gets more credit than anyone else. But having said that, she will. He's never gonna yield to her and yield the stage to her. Everybody has done something wrong. Everybody has disappointed him. Everybody is bad at what they do. I mean, everybody who works for him in the White House has to put up with this, and he spreads this. He puts this out. He calls his billionaire friends at night and says, Steve is disloyal, or Kellyanne Conway is whatever she is, all of this kind of stuff, and then he goes back to them and he says, whoever he was talking to, who he has told this, he then reports they told him that.
You have one of those phone calls almost word for word, and it's specified that it's 26 minutes long, and as a reader, you get the feeling that it's you on the other end of the phone. Question. Was that
you can assume whatever you think.
Okay, and when you get to that passage, readers can decide. And that struck me as that was part of what I was reacting to when I was hearing him saying, "I don't know Michael Wolff," and I'm looking at some of this material, and he says he never met you in the Oval Office. Well, this wouldn't be the Oval Office. That could have been 26 minutes on the phone, and it might be that no one in the White House even knows he made that kind of phone call.
Yeah. I'm sure they don't. I mean, he makes the phone calls are constant, and everybody is actually calling their sources in this kind of Trump coterie to find out who he has called, what he has said, what's going on. I mean, they would say what's going on in New York, because he's talking to the New York people.
In the White House, you describe Ivanka as actually being treated and regarded sort of functionally as the president's wife, and as the president's daughter. You describe Hope Hicks, who is one of those many people in this White House who there's no counterpart like her in any previous White House. There is this passage about Hope Hicks. Shortly after Lewandowski, with whom Hicks had an on and off romantic relationship, was fired in June 2016 for clashing with Trump family members, Hicks sat in Trump Tower with Trump and his sons, worrying about Lewandowski's treatment in the press and wondering aloud about how she might help him. Trump, who otherwise seemed to treat Hicks in a protective and even paternal way, looked up and said, "Why? You've already done enough for him. You're the best piece of he's going to have," sending Hicks running from the room. But Michael, according as we know, she still keeps coming back into that room, and she apparently is basically running Donald Trump's press separately and apart from the actual press office.
And she was that, but she's even taken a step up now. And I would now argue that she is the central. His central advisor in the White House.
29-year-old now. She's now 29.
Yeah, I mean, her experience before this was as a fashion, PR person.
And she is part of the, she was brought in by Ivanka Trump.
Exactly.
And she's part of the Jared-Ivanka faction as the factions line up in this book.
Yes.
There comes a point where Steve Bannon is just screaming at her in the halls of the West Wing, and in the end calling her dumb as stone. And this is after he suspects her of having tried to leak information that he supported the Comey firing.
Exactly. I mean, it was a brutal fight. It was a fight that kind of shook everybody in a brutal White House where there's fights every day. This was a legendary fight. As a matter of fact, in the Jarvanka side actually went and complained to the White House counsel about Bannon, that this was essentially accusing him of harassment.
And Jarvanka is the shorthand in the White House for Jared and Ivanka.
Yes.
Can we take a quick commercial break and come back and talk about what has become the central issue of discussion about this book, and that is the president's fitness to serve?
Of course.
Okay, we'll be right back. We'll be right back with more from Michael Wolff. We're back with Michael Wolff, the author of Fire and Fury Inside the Trump White House, soon to be available at your local bookstore once they get restocked after it being sold out. I want to go to a passage you have here early in the book, Michael, and it comes back, this concept comes back from time to time throughout the book. You talk about Trump's friends, known for a long time, very concerned that he was, quote, wholly lacking what in some obvious sense must be the main requirement of the job, what neuroscientists would call executive function.
The ability to distinguish cause and effect, the ability to adjust your behavior to different situations, the ability to organize and be orderly in the way you think.
Neurologists tell patients, make sure you've got your will and all that stuff done in your 60s at your latest, because for all of us, executive function is going to decline. If we live long enough, it's the ability to make choices, make rational choices, and so forth. In his case, there is much concern now about his general mental health, his general ability to actually keep himself composed and functional.
And it came up again and again in the really descriptions of the interactions with him. And I would say the thing that bothers...
This is staff talking to you,
yes,
saying it's changing, and it's changing over time.
And I would say the thing that bothered them most, just because you didn't know how to deal with it, it was so weird, is the repetitions. He just repeats and repeats and repeats and hammers on... It's not even hammering on a point. It's the same story. He tells, always has an anecdote, and then he will repeat it, and he will repeat it in the same words, the same expressions, the same tone, and you think, well, no, wait a minute. I mean, and I've heard this, and you start to think, oh no, I guess I'm just imagining this, and then you hear it a third time. And then everybody, and then a running theme was to chart this. Okay, it used to be 3 stories in 25 or 30 minutes, and then it was 3 stories in 10 or 15 minutes, the same 3 stories. And if you're working with the guy, you come away and, what do you think about this? How do you, none of these people, you can't You can't diagnose. You can even, it's even hard to discuss it among one another.
There's a moment in the book where Roger Ailes suggests John Boehner as the White House Chief of Staff, and Trump says, "Who's that?" And Trump used to know him, and that could be, if it's true, a failure of that kind of memory, which is how this kind of decline begins.
It could, or it could also be, in fairness, his utter inattention.
Yeah.
He's not thinking about anything but what he wants to think about. When I interviewed him in June, that was 2 weeks, I think, before the Brexit vote, and I asked him about that. And, you know, I asked him using the word Brexit, and he said what? Mm-hmm. And I said Brexit, and he repeated, what? And then I said, you know, the UK's exit from the EU, and then he said, oh yeah, that I'm in favor of that.
Almost everything they're doing can be redone by another government. Tax rates can go back up. We've seen that happen. The one thing that cannot be fixed after the fact is a nuclear exchange with North Korea. How worried are you about the possibility of a nuclear exchange with North Korea?
You know, maybe naively, not too worried. Not too worried because this is a guy who doesn't want to, you know, going to war. You know, I mean, I think George Bush decided he wanted to go to war. I think Donald Trump sees that, gets nothing out of that. It's like, what do we get for that? You know, and that may be a good thing. In this utter transactional understanding of the world, it's, you know, do I really care about that? Now, on the other hand, if the configuration starts and he has to analyze this in some particular nuanced way, I would be awfully worried.
Michael Wolff, thank you very much for giving us some extra time tonight. Really appreciate you joining us. Really glad to have you here.